often were you able to talk to your mum and your dad?
Well, we used to correspond. I think they wrote to me more than I wrote to them, as one does. I mean, as a
Yeah.
boy, one is sort of tied up with school and cricket and all the rest of it. But I used to get, so they paid £1 a week, I remember, for my board and lodging, and I suppose I had one visit from my father, I seem to remember, in 2 years, and I don't remember my mother visiting at all, but she used to write very often, send me sweets and what have you, and
So when you eventually went home, how do you think having not seen them for so long affected your relationships with them?
it must have done. It must have done. Not that we had ever been a very close family. I was very close to my sister, Pat, and she used to write to me occasionally.
Yeah.
But it affected my relationship with my family quite a lot, I think. Yeah.
And do you remember sort of what you felt when you had to say goodbye, and then when when you got home, what were you feeling? What were
Well, when I said goodbye, I think there was a lot of excitement in the air. It was an adventure for me. I was only 11 rather, and I was just full of adventure. The idea of going off with all these kids down to somewhere one didn't know, and an uncertain future and so on. I wasn't frightened. I was just exhilarated by it all, going off. And when I came back, I don't really remember very much about that. I suppose I just slotted in as usual, really.
Yeah. But I mean, can't have been easy, obviously.
No, I don't suppose it was, really.
So when you stayed in Devon, was there an airport near you? An air base at all?
No, there wasn't. There wasn't an air base. I suppose Exeter would have had an airfield, but that
Yeah.
was probably 25 miles away from where I was at Paynton. We used to watch the German fighter bombers, the Focke-Wulf 190s. They used to come and do hit and run raids because it was a training centre for the Royal Air Force. Torquay, all the hotels were taken over for training, giving ground training to air crew, and so the hotels were all taken over, and the Germans knew about this, and they used to send in their Focke-Wulf 190s and come in during daylight and streak along the beach and drop bombs. And they had a Sunday school, I remember once, and on a Sunday, and I think about 20 or 30 kids were killed during that raid.
Because I mean,
It was all very exciting. They used to come roaring along the beach, and Don and I, who were usually playing in the surf or in the sand, we used to shout at them, go away, and the guns on the beach used to bang away at them, or never hit them, mind you. I think they did hit an RAF plane once on one occasion because it crashed at Babbacombe near Torquay, and the pilot was okay, but we could see the plane on the beach.
Do you remember what it smelled like or sounded like? I imagine it.
The smells and sounds. There's a lot of noise, and I suppose, yes. It's difficult to remember sounds and smells, really. Yeah.
Was there much activity when an air raid siren did go off? Was there panic? Was there an organised feeling? What was it like?
When the air raid siren went off, I think it was quite orderly, and people didn't panic. They went quietly into the air raid shelters, took their place in them, and waited for the all clear to go. In fact, we had air raid sirens going off when we were in school, and we all filed into the shelters. And I remember trying to get near the entrance to the air raid shelter so I could see what was going on above. And I remember putting my head out of the air raid shelter and seeing the dogfight going on overhead, 20, 30,000 feet above.
Wow.
When the RAF, the fighters, used to wheel and machine gun the German bombers and fighters, and there used to be dogfights going on overhead. Quite exciting, really.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that it happened during school. Do you think during those years that you were evacuated, do you think it had a big impact on your education at the time? I mean, I know you were young, but...
I'm sure it did. I left school at 15, and the war was still going on when I left school. But my father felt that because the troops, when the war ended, I think everyone felt the war was going to end fairly soon, and my father felt, well, when the war ends, all the soldiers and airmen and sailors and so on could come back and take whatever jobs are going.
Yeah.
So he felt that I should leave school and get into work quickly before they came back.
Sure. And I mean, you said that you remembered the planes were sort of going after, the hotel where they were training, and I suppose that was sort of they went for the tactical approach. But when that shifted to a sort of approach that was focused on destroying the British morale, during the Blitz, do you recall there being a sort of a change in emotion in yourself and in people around you?
Well, I was maturing, you see, during the war. And I suppose at 13, 14, 15, you begin to understand what's happening. And during the Blitz, I had seen sights which I don't think any 11-year-old should see. I mean, there were bodies lying in the streets and houses burning and being destroyed and so on. So it dawned on me that this wasn't child's play. This was real stuff.
Yeah.
And I just remember feeling how I wasn't frightened, but I remember feeling how devastating war is, and it always has been, really, I suppose.
And you feel that might have been sort of reflected, throughout the general population? I mean, you said there was not much went on for a year, but it was sort of exciting. But do you think when the Blitz hit, there was a sort of realization of how serious the whole thing was?
Yes, I think so. I think the first year after war was declared was a sort of phony war, really, and nothing seemed to happen. But then when the Blitz started in earnest, and that lasted for about 8 or 9 months, I think, and thousands, hundreds of thousands were killed in London. And I'm certain that the realization dawned on everybody. And we were all then determined to win. There was no doubt about it. The determination in Britain to win this wretched war was paramount, I think, yeah.
And when the Germans did give up the sort of the attempt to invade Britain and headed off towards Russia instead, was what was the atmosphere like? Was it euphoric, or there would have been devastation, wouldn't there?
I think it was euphoric. I think the idea that Germany had reversed its decision to invade Britain and invade Russia instead had a profound effect on everybody. By that time, the Americans were coming into the war. I think they came in 43, I think they came into the war. So we'd been fighting the Germans for a long time by then. And then the Americans came in, and then, of course, everything changed. I mean, the place was full of Americans, it was full of American bombers, and we weren't, there was no doubt about it that we were going to beat the Germans eventually. The odds against against them winning were too great, you know.
Sure, yeah. And you know, I mean, another sort of a really broad question, but for how long after the war had finished do you think you were still feeling the effects of it?
Well, let's see, when the war ended, I was working in London. But before the war ended, and I was working in London in the bank, we were still being hit by V-1 flying bombs, doodlebugs we call them, and V-2s, the German rocket that came down with devastating effect without any warning at all. So sitting in the bank, one would hear these doodlebugs, and they'd go along, and when the engine stopped, they'd crash to the ground and cause devastation. And when the V-2 rockets came over, of course, you had no warning, and all of a sudden there's a tremendous explosion, and people killed, and buildings collapsed, and all the rest of it. And in the bank, I remember hearing on many occasions, crump of V-2 rockets suddenly crashing down to the ground. So when the war did finally end and Germany capitulated, we in Britain were euphoric. There were great celebrations in the streets, and people danced and sang, and everyone was sort of, although there was a lot of privation around, there was very little food, and clothing was rationed and all the rest. We were just euphoric, really, and
sure.
Everyone went mad, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's sort of pretty much it. Was there anything else you think you'd like to add, or?
I don't think so. I think it had a devastating effect. The war had a devastating effect on my family.
Yeah.
Because my father, who'd been in the First World War and knew what war could bring, he was traumatized by the war, and he, I think, more than any of us, was so moved by the war that it was very difficult. The relationship between him and I became rather difficult, I think.
Do you think that may have been...
It did have an effect on the family, the war. And I'm sure that current wars in Afghanistan and so on are going to have a traumatic effect on the population there. These youngsters, you see them on the television every day, are going through absolute hell, and their whole life is disrupted, and they'll carry this with them for the rest of their lives. I'm sure they will.